When programming a video game's artificial intelligence, you typically work backwards. You start with an all-seeing, all-powerful being, which has no issue with locating, moving towards, and eliminating the player, wherever they may be. Then you start to program in stupidity. You give it a limited range of vision and hearing, and make it unable to see through walls or behind cover. The trick to a good stealth game is AI which is smart enough to be believable, dumb enough to be beatable. With his new game Volume, Mike Bithell digs deep into the genre, breaking it down to its most basic elements, and mixes in his trademark humour and heart. Like his previous effort, Thomas Was Alone, Volume starts basic, slowly drip-feeding you new abilities, enemies, obstacles, and gadgets as you move through a series of increasingly difficult challenges. It worked great in Thomas, and not much has changed here. The obvious comparison, both structurally and visually, is Metal Gear Solid's VR training missions. New ideas are introduced thick and fast, and this mechanical progression is fairly transparent, with the levels following a basic repeating loop. A new mechanic is introduced, that mechanic is presented in conjunction with an already introduced mechanic, and then your mastery of that new mechanic is tested in a more challenging situation. It's a pretty cut and dry design philosophy, more like a puzzle game in its delivery of new ideas and dynamics than a traditional stealth game, despite its attempt at a grandiose plot. This design does lack a certain subtlety, and it feels like a less strict and predictable structure would have made for a more natural and overall enjoyable game. That being said, there are some genuinely well-designed levels sprinkled throughout the game which are really fun to play through, forcing you to think in new ways about your abilities, toolset, and the behaviours of enemies. These make the rest of the game worth slogging through, even if they are few and far between. The core loop of Volume is pretty repetitive, as it basically just entails avoiding guards, collecting gems, and reaching a small square of light to complete the level. The guards are dumb, the gems are barely justified within the logic of the game, and the environments are blocky, jagged, and unnatural, and Bithell is well aware of this. There are plenty of jokes at the expense of the stealth genre, game design practices, and internet culture to be found here. In Thomas Was Alone, this was mostly enjoyable. Bithell was a fresh new voice, not afraid to poke fun at his peers. But Volume refuses to turn that humorous gaze on itself, and comes off as cynical and a little holier than thou. If you're going to constantly crack jokes at the mechanics, cliches, and design motifs of an entire genre, you better make damn sure your own interpretation of those elements is airtight. Unfortunately for Volume, it's far from it. I understand that it's all meant to be harmless fun, but pointing out that a level designer has used a certain element of the environment to draw your attention isn't really the height of wit. It's just part of level design. The problem is not that Volume makes all these jokes or observations, it's that it suffers from the exact same issues it makes fun of. You know what would be better than having shoddy guard AI just so you can make fun of shoddy guard AI? Not having shoddy guard AI. Thankfully, it's not all bad. On the whole, the mechanics are engaging, and the way that Bithell weaves the gadgets in with the rest of the experience makes for some really interesting and fun dynamics. There are some minor annoyances with these toys, including a bizarre cooldown which occurs whenever you pick one up, which totally breaks the flow of gameplay, but overall they add some much needed spice to an otherwise rigid structure. As well as new gadgets, abilities, and environmental obstacles, new enemy types are frequently thrown into the mix, which provides some neat variety. They don't really change the core gameplay loop in any major way, but they do make you rethink the way you approach certain situations and how you utilise the environment. For instance, there are enemies which can spot you from far away but are slow to attack, which forces you to duck down as you move towards them, or enemies with a full circle of awareness, which force you to quickly move around them. These lines of sight, made bold and obvious, are a key part of Volume's aesthetic of clarity. It breaks down the stealth genre into what it really is, recognizing patterns, exploiting the slow, deliberate nature of the enemy's movement, and using the environment to your advantage. This game features stealth cliches both to make fun of them, and to encourage you to think about them in new ways. It doesn't quite reach the level of meta gameplay that you can tell the developers were hoping for, but there is room for mastery here. The more you engage with the relatively simple, repeating gameplay loops, the more you'll be distracting guards, using gadgets, and snapping up gems without skipping a beat. The large, bold sightlines and enemy movements also form a large part of Volume's visual appeal. The patterns and shapes that form when these lines of sight overlap or get blocked by the environment are fascinating, and form another rearranging of some long-established elements of the stealth genre. An unfortunate exception to this is the shadows. What could have been another pleasing visual element becomes just some soft, blurry smudges on the ground, which subtly support the bold visual design, rather than form an important part of it. Overall though, Volume features a super interesting aesthetic, with simple colours, shapes, and map layouts repeating across levels to highlight where a certain gadget or strategy might be useful. The way levels shift and form when you enter them, or break apart slightly when you make a sound, really gives this game a unique visual flavour, which goes beyond the bland, minimalist style many games choose to adopt. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the game's audio. David Howson returns to score the game after his excellent work on Thomas Was Alone, and that particular influence carries over to this project as a soft, contemplative ambience. However, when you get caught, the game absolutely blares this abrupt music at you, which is totally at odds with the rest of the score. It's just way too loud, and really takes you out of it. The other aspect of the audio, the voice acting, is also a bit under par. Danny Wallace turns in another great performance as your AI companion, but YouTuber Charlie McDonnell, as lead character Rob, gives the minimum amount of emotion and charisma as he can get away with, and comes off as sounding flat, bored, and disinterested. The conversations between Rob and the AI occur during general gameplay, and instead of keeping things moving, as the voiceover did in Thomas Was Alone, they go on for so long that it's possible to beat the level before they finish yapping, especially when pausing the game, viewing a tip, and getting seen restarts the current line of dialogue all over. The story behind these pieces of dialogue is also a little lackluster. I didn't really have any idea what was going on until quite late into the game. There's mission briefs before each level, which out of context make little sense, as well as conversations between Rob and the game's antagonist Guy Gisborne, which deal with some rather undercooked references to wealth, power, class, and the internet era. It's still a compelling game, but more for its mechanics and gameplay systems than its attempt at a modern-day Robin Hood fable. Volume is about as video gamey as a video game can get. Guards stare blankly at walls without moving, floating gems litter the obstacle courses that make up the single-player missions, and the levels are blocky, rigid, and exist purely to test and challenge your knowledge of the mechanics, nothing more. Taken as such, Volume is a fun stealth game that plays with its genre in some really interesting ways. It isn't afraid to crack a joke or two along the way. Taken as the epic tale of corruption, greed, and justice that the developers so obviously want it to be, however, it does fall a little flat. While not quite reaching the heights of its predecessor, Volume nonetheless remains a vibrant and exciting stealth game, and is certainly worth a look.